So this week's lesson is called Blessed Are the Poor, Following with Justice. And we will be talking about justice and about poverty as we go through the class. And here are two key verses that I decided to just kick things off with. The first one is extremely familiar to all of us. It's one of the Beatitudes. In fact, it's the first Beatitude, and it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And that one is repeated both in Matthew and in Luke in the Beatitudes. And then there's another one, also a Beatitude, which reads, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And you know that in the first session, I was talking about the kingdom of heaven, and I pointed out that our authors both prefer to use the reign of God as opposed to the kingdom of heaven, which they say is a better translation of the original Greek word. So you can think kingdom of heaven if you want, or you can think reign of God, but at least the way I'm looking at it, this is something that we become part of when we become a Christian, and it's something that we grow into throughout our Christian lives, just as the pastor was talking about in this morning's sermon as he was addressing the new confirmands. We never attain perfection. We're never going to really get there in this life, but it's something to strive for. And once Christ has become a part of us and the Holy Spirit has become a part of us, then we can leverage that to grow into God's kingdom. And that's my best way of expressing it, which may be imperfect. I also was struck, now I don't know how many people, when we sing a hymn in church, actually paying attention to what the words say. Okay, but I was struck by that final hymn that we sang in church this morning. So I took a photo of it from the hymn book. And I'm just going to lead us off by, if I can get this to blow up to where I can actually read it, reading the last verse of that hymn that we all just sang a few minutes ago. Okay, and it says, "So God grant us for tomorrow ways to order human life that surround each person's sorrow with a calm that conquers strife." Think about that. Help us to order human life in a way that can surround the sorrow that people have with a way to conquer the strife that exists. Make us partners in our living, our compassion to increase. Messengers of faith, thus giving hope and confidence and peace. So that's a fine message. We all just sang it. I was busy paying attention to the notes, maybe more so to the notes than the words, but I think that that's a great sentiment to kick this off with. Let's do what we can to improve the world, to surround each person's sorrow with compassion, and to bring hope and peace to the people around us. Okay, that is a real part of the call, and it's a part of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I'm going to kick us off with this section from Matthew 25. And I need to let that go away. So this will be a fairly long reading. It's two pretty full pages. And Russ, when someone does agree to read it, please point the camera at them.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Is anyone willing to read this for us? Al's going to do it.
I always like to go. Ready for me, Russ?
You're on, Al.
"When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison and you did not look after me. They also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? He will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life.
Thank you, Al. So in order to fully appreciate that passage, I think we need to look a little bit at the society that Jesus was living in at the time. And in Rohr's book in chapter 4, he goes into this in a lot of detail. If you have the book, maybe you'll go home and read that chapter and get even more than I'm going to bring out of it. But basically what he said was that the society was very stratified. There were actually 9 classes of people in that society. Okay, and they were divided into 2 parts. There were the ruling classes and there were the peasant classes. The ruling classes you can see listed there, and the peasant classes you can also see listed there. And here's the way the population broke out. The ruling class was about 20% of the population, and the peasant class was about 80% of the population. So there were a lot more peasants than rulers. But in terms of the way the wealth was distributed, the wealth was held, 95% of the wealth was held by the ruling class and only 5% by the peasant classes. So there was a distinct difference in opportunity and wealth between the ruling class and the peasant class. And here's a little bit more about that. I'll go through it pretty quickly. It's in Rohr's book in more detail. So the ruler would have been the king, or someone like a king. And that person, maybe it was Herod or whatever king was sitting on the throne in Jerusalem at the time, had access to 50% of the gross national product of the community. The governing class, the bureaucrats and the nobles, had another 25% of that. And then there were what he calls the retainer class, which were the military, the scribes, and the teachers. So when you read, you teachers of the law, you hypocrites, in those woes that Jesus spoke in Matthew, he's talking about people in this retainer class here. There was a merchant class, but it was small. These days in our society, a merchant class would be much larger. And then there was the priestly class, which owned land and held significant wealth. So the Pharisees, the priests, the Levites, I guess it would have been, were landowners and had a lot of possessions. That religious establishment was part of the ruling class, and Jesus' message was threatening to them. That's, as you guys are all well aware of that much. Okay. In the peasant class were the farmers. Probably the largest group of peasants were people farming the land, or maybe shepherds and folks like that. But whatever they would earn from their farms or their herd of sheep or whatever they had, 2/3 of it would be given away in the form of rent, taxes, and tolls. So they could only keep 1/3 of what they earned, and then they would have to reinvest a portion of that back into seed for the next year's crop or feed for the animals. So they had to live on what was left after that. And 2/3 of it went to other people that just would take it by some sort of right that existed in the society. There were artisans, but they were only about 5% of the population, skilled workers like carpenters. And we know that Jesus' father, Joseph, was a carpenter. Jesus Jesus was identified in the scripture as a carpenter himself, son of a carpenter, also a carpenter. That's sort of the way things went, because it wasn't possible to get out of the lower class into the upper class. Then there were unclean people who did things like farm pigs. Okay. And then there were what Rohr calls the expendables, people who were unemployed, unemployable, beggars, lepers, criminals. And when Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," the word for poor, which I have there, I won't even make any attempt to pronounce, referred to that lowest of the lower class. Okay, and Jesus calls them blessed. Jesus ministered to the very bottom rung of society. It's important for us to realize that. Here's a very famous quote from Abraham Lincoln, which comes from one of the Lincoln Douglas debates. Would somebody be willing to read this aloud for us in Lincoln's voice? Roger's going to try. At least we've got the beard, so.
It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other the divine right of kings. It is the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that says, "You toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it." No matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle.
Very famous quote. Abraham Lincoln said that. It mirrors what we are seeing in the scripture here. And unfortunately, it's still a problem now. So which class of people did Jesus champion?
Sounds like he championed the poor.
Everybody is saying the poor. I'm not sure if
Well, he loves everybody, so, I mean, but I think he's going after the poor people because they just don't have anybody to look after
Do you
them.
think that would be typical of a rabbi in those days?
In those days, no. Because they get all the money. The rabbis and the Pharisees, and they're well off. They don't care. They don't care about people not eating. They should care, but they don't. They didn't in those days anyway.
Some may have, we can't generalize about all of them, but we do know that Jesus came down on some of them pretty hard. So you're right, it was definitely the poor. And here are a few verses, I'll just read these. In Matthew 19, Jesus answered, "If you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." Now that's taken out of context. I'm pretty sure all of you are aware of it. Do you remember what the context was?
Wasn't that the rich man? The rich
Yeah.
man who went to Jesus and he said, "What do I have to do to get into heaven?"
Gain eternal life, I think, yeah. And what was the outcome of that discourse?
Goodbye.
He didn't do it.
He went away sorrowing, I think, if I remember the way it came out. Okay, now, I'm stuttering here. We've all heard dozens of sermons on that particular story, right? I think it's so familiar to us all, the rich young ruler, and there's always apologies for it. And the apology is that it's not a mandate for us to sell all our possessions, give them to the poor, and follow Jesus. We're taught that's not a mandate. We don't all need to do that. Okay, but what it is telling us is that if we're putting other things ahead of Christ, that's a problem. If our wealth is too important to us, that's a problem. if we're not willing to sacrifice something to help other people, that's a problem. You know, this is maybe a little bit of a hyperbole in this story of the rich young ruler, but it's still a story that we should take to heart. Okay, in Luke 4, Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed." Once again, the emphasis is on preaching to the poor. Jesus is reaching out to everyone. He's reaching out particularly to those that nobody else would have reached out to. Talks about the prisoners, talks about recovery of sight to the blind. In Luke 14, this is part of another parable. I guess it comes after a parable. He talks about it. Who remembers the parable that this one goes with? He says, "But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind."
This is the rich man who threw a banquet and nobody came.
Right. And so he sent out and said, "Bring the poor in." Right. And Jesus is using that parable as an illustration to make this point, that we should include the poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind. In Matthew 11, he said, "The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor." Preaching the good news to the poor, something that, really is important. And it's not only preaching the good news, is it?
Mm-mm.
What else? What else is implicit in this, Russ?
Oh, what else is implicit is doing and giving, and your intentions. Your intentions need to be, you're willing to sacrifice what you have in order to help other people. You're putting other people before yourself, essentially.
And which other people?
All other people, but mostly the marginalized, those who are ostracized from society, the poor, the unlovable.
I think that's a good way to put it. He's telling us to love the unlovable. And it's hard to love, they're unlovable because they're unlovable, right? So it's hard.
Aren't some of the unlovable the ones who won't love the unlovables?
Unlovable.
What did Jesus say about the rich and powerful? Anybody
There is
think of
the one
anything?
about how we talked about this one a little last week, how it's harder for a rich man to enter into heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle.
Yeah, that's one thing he said. Anyone remember anything else?
No.
Pastor was saying, "Whoa there." Yeah. All right. Well, let's see what I have on the slide.
Well, you probably have the same one. Last week, we talked about, help me, other people, probably. The love of money is the root of all evil. I don't know if that was Jesus. I think so.
I think that's Old Testament.
Timothy.
Oh, was it in Timothy? Okay. Well, here's the ones I came up with. There's the woe the pastor was talking about. It says, "Woe, you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." So, they were tithing, but they weren't tithing in the right spirit, I guess is the way you would have to put it. So he brings out this idea of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Justice and mercy. Okay. Today, justice is one of the things that we're really going to be talking about. Justice for the poor. And then there's the one that you quoted, Al, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And then there's another one that says, but woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort.
So the real wealthy people in that society were the clergy. Who
Well, the king had money too.
and had vast wealth. But is that what gave rise to the vow of poverty among early Christian clergy?
It wouldn't surprise me. Pastor probably knows more about that than I do.
It's actually more complicated than that. The desert fathers, we went to the early centuries. They left cities and towns and civilized society, going to the desert so they could devote themselves to prayer. So forth. It really was a spiritual revival, rather than economic or social. So they wanted to. Paul said that too. I wish I could do that. First Corinthians 7 there. So don't get married, go away. The problem is people got wind of this and they would go visit them. So they didn't become themselves wealthy. It wasn't for wealth that they were fleeing from. By the time you get to Francis, yes, it is. There's church that already has money, but in the early centuries, church didn't have money. In fact, Paul was going around the Mediterranean basin collecting money to pay back to the poor in Jerusalem. So at some point later on, wealth does, after the 4th century, really, when Christianity is legal, 313 Edict of Milan, Constantine makes it okay to be Christian now. You can come out from the basement, but there's still not an acceptance of it. Once Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, then you can talk about clergy with money and power and stuff like that. But, does that make some sense? So in the early centuries, they would not be, certainly in the Bible context, they're still predominantly not in power, not with money.
Well, I think Roger's question was, why did monks have to take a vow of poverty?
Well, yeah, way later on, sure.
Yeah. So is that a reaction to the wealth?
Well, this is following Jesus' commands, really.
Was it a reaction to the wealth of the
That's why it's complicated. No, I don't think so. It's trying to follow Jesus. So what happens is people try to follow things like this, and it's very hard, very complicated. So Origen, for instance, he castrates himself. Anyway, there's a passage where he took it too literally. So people trying to follow Jesus. One of them is giving up wealth, right? But chastity also, but not everybody stays celibate or not married. Paul says, okay, you can marry if you like. So there's a development all over the place in different ways. There's no systematized monasticism that arises until the scholastic.
I mean, if everybody was celibate, then the religion would die out very quickly.
Sure, Shakers.
Yeah, right.
But to be fair to the Shakers and the early church, they expected the world to be ended very, very soon. So Paul writes, there's no point in bringing babies into the world. So if you can help it, devote yourself to prayer and to the Lord rather than get married. But if you can't help it, sure, get married and have sex.
Okay, but you know what is those things that you were just talking about, the vow of poverty, chastity, and so forth, to me seem still like a form of legalism. And this is human. It's very human nature to go and take this and say, okay, let me write down a set of rules. Let me get a set of rules so I know what the rules are, and then I can follow those rules, and I'm fine. So I'm going to put aside wealth, but the real rule is about relationships. It's about how we treat other people. It's about our relationship with other people. That one's harder to write down. It's harder to quantify. It's hard to be legalistic about. Okay, let's see what I have here next. So Jesus' concern for the poor and disdain for the rich is intertwined with the idea of justice. In fact, the word justice, I did word searches. When I'm preparing for these lessons, I do word searches on the Bible. And I did a word search for justice, and I also did a word search for the poor, and they both turned up a lot, but justice turned up even more frequently than the poor. So justice is called for more than even discussion of the poor. And the two are often entwined together. And here's some examples where they both appear. It's in Psalm 140, it says, I know that the Lord secures justice for the poor and upholds the cause of the needy. In Proverbs, it says, the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. In Isaiah, it says, woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights, and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless.
Those
So-
are all Old Testament
Yeah.
citations.
So, I guess it was Rohr took the Beatitudes and broke them down this way. And I think we talked about righteousness. I'm going to digress a little bit. The pastor at the beginning of the sermon started to talk about righteousness, and then I lost that thread in the sermon. I thought it might get elaborated on more. I was hoping so. Pastor Judith used to point to a cross. We don't have a cross in here. She would say the cross has a vertical component, okay, that represents the relationship that we have with God. So the great commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. But the other part of the great commandment is, Pastor Judith would point to the horizontal part of the cross and say, the other part of the commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. It's that part, that's the horizontal part of the cross that means reaching out to the people around you. Okay, so vertical is the God part, horizontal is the neighbor part. They're really inseparable. And I've always felt, and I know I found this in a commentary once back in the day, and I can't even remember what reference it was, but the commentator pointed out that Paul often uses holiness and righteousness in the same sentence. He will say, he'll say something and live in holiness and righteousness or something like that. Okay, and the commentator said, holiness is that vertical relationship with God. Righteousness is about your relationship with other people. So, Rohr breaks the Beatitudes down, and he points out that the first three talk about who the person is. Blessed are the people who are poor, the people who are mourn, the people who are meek. And then it's interrupted with blessed for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And then three more come that deal a little bit more with how people relate to others. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those that are pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. And then he caps that off with another one that says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. So it's kind of bracketed by this righteousness. And then both Rohr and Lowry point to the words that are used for righteousness and says another possible translation of that word would be justice. And so when we talk about justice, we might be thinking about righteous life means justice. Justice for the people around us. So here's what Rohr says about that. He says, notice that the concept of justice is exactly halfway through the Beatitudes and appears again at the very end. It's a couplet stating, this is the point. To live a just life in this world is to have identified with the longings and hungers of the poor, the meek, and those who weep. This identification and solidarity are already a profound form of social justice. The Beatitude is surely both spiritual and social. So what does justice mean?
Fairness.
Fairness? Anybody else have anything to say about justice?
Yeah.
I wrote a paper in maybe junior high about justice, but one angle is the administration of law, but you might go beyond that to the fair administration of law.
Yeah, so laws are one aspect of justice, and we have judges and so forth. Here's what the dictionary says. It says the attainment of what is just, especially that which is fair, moral, right, merited, or in accordance with law. fairness, moral, right, merited. Was the treatment of the peasant class in Jesus' time fair, moral, right, or merited?
Sound like it.
Would have depended on who you ask.
Well, I'm not asking them, I'm asking you.
It doesn't sound it. Sounds like there was a tremendous inequality.
Inequality brought on by social structure that was kind of immutable.
But the dictionary definition didn't say anything about equality.
It talks about fairness,
It talks
though.
about fairness, but it doesn't equate.
Well, is it fair?
equality.
Is it fair for somebody to bake the bread and you eat it? That seems unfair.
This also is very complicated. So, so you asked the question, what is justice? Very, very big. You can spend a year on this, not just legally, but biblically speaking, there is a simple version. And the best image is in front of courthouses where you have Lady Justice, usually with a blindfold and a scale. The idea is that it's impartial, and you see that through scriptures as well, and that there is a scale that weighs things. And so you mentioned equality, that's really ours. In the ancient world, I don't know of any society that considered human beings equal. That right from the get-go. Greek society sometimes cast away, kill babies if they're not strong enough and so forth. Eskimos still do, apparently did for decades ago. Because there was the idea that you needed to recognize the different levels of ability and so forth. So our sense of equality, if we project it back to the world, the answer would be no, nowhere. But was it fair? That's a different question in terms of the scale. I don't know if you're familiar with Code of Hammurabi, one of the best well-known ancient ones. And it lays out, at least in the Akkadian Babylonian culture, what is fair and just, scale-wise. But in that society, aristocrats' tooth was worth more than a peasant's tooth. So there are shekels assigned to the values of them. Just like an insurance adjuster comes in, well, what is that worth? That damage is worth this. And the Israelite code that you find in the Bible is the only one that is not dependent on what class of people you belong to. But those classes, in fact, in India, they're considered fair, whether by accident of history, where you were born, no one had a choice in the matter, but they were fair according to where you were in society. So the idea was what was fair, and that meant what was even on the scale. So aristocrats tooth.
But the point is, Jesus was breaking those molds.
Yes, but I just want to make sure that our conversation doesn't.
In turn, the Declaration of Independence that says we believe that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator by certain, that all comes from Christian ethics. Okay, what we in the United States and probably Western Europe too have as our ethical code all really derived from this long history of Christianity. Okay, and they all trace back to these teachings of Jesus, which were radically different at the time. So to say what people in India think is fair is irrelevant to this, because what we are trying to dig into is what does Jesus define as fairness?
And in Jesus' own words, fair for Israel and the Gentile reflects his time. We have to translate it to our time. So, for instance, the woman, Syrophoenician woman, who wants her daughter healed, and he says to her, "No, I'm not going to give the children's food to dogs." He insults her.
Wasn't he playing with her in that case?
Well, we could interpret it in many ways, but I'm just pointing out, Jesus knew in his time that there was no equality that we speak of human beings on the same level. In fact, in the Bible with Jesus himself, take this is for Jews.
But that's the lesson of that story, right? The lesson of that story is to break through that barrier, because he did. He said, but because of your faith, okay, I'm going to do it.
Because of the faith, right? That's
okay. So what he said to her was, well, you're a Gentile, in our culture, you don't deserve this, but in my kingdom, under the reign of God, you do, because of your faith.
I would also point out that the image of justice blind holding the scale.
Yeah.
That scale is a starting point being equal. In the case of a legal dispute, it's not going to end up equal. One side is going to prevail.
Well, the idea in the ancient world, the principle in Jesus' world and the biblical world is that there is a scale in the universe and everything is even to start.
Right.
So even doesn't mean you're equal, but even to start. So that's why you have valleys made high and mountains made low. That's the idea of biblical justice, everything's flat. And that just means flat. And dikai suni, which is the word behind righteousness and justification and justice, is a Greek concept of this flatness. But flatness, not equality, but flatness of treatment. And so you're right, you're both right in a sense here. In the ancient world, you could have fairness for Jesus too, but not the sameness. I don't know if that makes sense to us because of the Declaration of Independence and all created equal kind of, we believe that. But I just was cautioning against our reading back into the Bible what we know is true, and Jesus might fail at some of these points as well as Paul, that they have understanding of the world in their time, and that we shouldn't be too disappointed that they don't reflect our sense of justice or equality.
Yeah,
But justice meant tooth for tooth, eye for eye, life for life, everything was equal.
But Jesus said not an eye for an eye.
Well, right.
Okay, I mean, stop it. I mean,
Well, I'm saying the culture.
yeah, but Jesus was, he was a radical departure from the culture. That's the whole point of being a Christian, is to understand. That's why I'm trying to teach this class, because it's hard to follow Jesus. It's much easier to just stick with what's in the culture. Okay, and he didn't want people to stick in that culture of peasants and rich. So he says, woe to the rich and blessed are the poor.
Which is also very common.
I wonder if we can separate justice from the law.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can say to us, justice in our lives when we're thinking of following Jesus is providing for people other than ourselves and fulfilling their needs. I think that might be a way of saying that is serving justice to the people who are needy, providing for them. And so in our minds, we look for ways to help people who have needs. And maybe that is a form of justice rather than the law.
James. Which is law too. James and Matthew are very legal. No, yeah, what Jay said is fine. So we need to understand the culture before it's good.
But like Jay said, our country was based on that idea that our laws would be moral, that we do provide programs to help the poor. Not that we shouldn't do more on a personal level, but our laws are trying to be inclusive and helping those in need, because it is based on this, Christian principles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So to my way of thinking, and I believe that my way of thinking is based on a lifetime of reading the Bible and studying the Bible. Kings and priests who inherited their positions of power and wealth and oppress people that are poor is not just, not fair. Even though they might have thought it was fair at the time, it wasn't. It's not fair. Okay, it's not just. And I'm not going to back down off that position. You guys can have your own.
For us, it's not fair. For them, it was a different idea of fairness.
They thought it was fair, but Jesus came to say, this isn't fair. Every mountain is going to be made low. All the valleys are going to be made high. So it was essentially a caste system. You brought up the caste system in India, in which ancestry was used to keep people in their assigned places. And that certainly is the way things were and maybe still are in India. So the Bible calls for justice, and doesn't even limit that to the Israelites. So here in Deuteronomy, it says, do not deprive the alien or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of a widow as a pledge. In Ezekiel, it says, the people of the land practice extortion and commit robbery. They oppress the poor and needy and mistreat the alien, denying them justice. And then in Malachi, he says, so I will come near you for judgment. I will be quick to testify against sorcerers, adulterers, and perjurers, against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive aliens of justice. but do not fear me, says the Lord Almighty. Okay, so maybe in the culture, people thought doing these things was fine, but not according to the prophets, not according to Christian teachings. And Jesus' teachings were disruptive to that order. When he gave sight to a blind man or declared a leper clean, he disrupted and threatened the social order, because that leper was down in that untouchable class.
Mhm.
And Jesus said, "You're clean, go show the priest." The priests held a whole inquisition. What do you mean this guy's clean? He's not clean. Let's find his mother. I guess that was the blind man.
The blind man. Yeah.
This is a fraud. This must be a fraud. This guy doesn't belong here. So it's at least in Rohr's mind, and I think he's right, it's that kind of stuff that antagonized the Pharisees and the Sadducees so much that they demanded the crucifixion. It was the fact that Jesus was threatening that social order, not that Jesus was claiming to be the Son of God.
He was also kind of snubbing the purity laws by touching the sick, touching the lepers, touching the dead.
Right.
Drove them nuts.
Right.
Yeah, challenge their authority.
Yeah. Challenge the law. Right.
Challenge their view of the law. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lowry says the truth is that all are one in God. The lie is that there's no God but ourselves. We reveal that we believe that lie, not by what we say, we believe, but by how we live. We face a spiritual battle as the truth faces off with the lie. The battle is with our idols, our self-made images, all extensions of ourselves. And those would be the things like wealth and power and family and even church that I had in the first lesson. They take the form of our desires and attitudes, our blood and kindred, our nation, our pleasures, power, and money. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Lowry writes that the Greek word for righteousness in the above text shares similar meanings to that of these Hebrew words that I won't try to pronounce, that are expressed in the message of the prophet Amos, where he says, "But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." So by translating that as justice, Lowry connects it more firmly with the dominant idea in Hebrew scripture, where Israel is called to give care to orphans, widows, and refugees. Jesus acted justly even when it got him into trouble, when he was healing on the Sabbath, when he would speak to women, even women of ill repute, when he would touch a leper, when he would converse with a Samaritan or a Gentile. He was acting justly, but he was getting himself in trouble because he was threatening that order that we talked about there. So there's this book, which I recommend. I have a couple of books I would recommend. This one is called Cast. It's by someone named Isabel Wilkerson, and it was a best.
Just by the way, it was made into a movie called Origin.
Really?
Which is a very striking.
What do you call it? Origin?
Origin.
Margin.
No, Origin.
Origin. Thank you.
Or Origins.
I didn't realize. I don't know how you would have made a movie out of that book.
Oh, he focused on. Well, I'll let you go if I can say anything useful.
Anyway, it was a Times bestseller, and it was an Oprah Winfrey book, but it's very challenging. And in there, she says, a caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human values that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed life and death meanings in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste whose forebears designed it. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the rank groupings apart, distinct from another, and in their assigned places. So the caste system I think she named the whole book after the caste system in India, which is, I think, what she discusses in the first chapter. But she goes on to talk about other instances of this type of thing and brings it down to racism in America, of course, which is mainly what the theme of the book is.
Could I make a couple of comments? One is, there has always been stratification in human societies. There are different theories about its causes. What's particularly evil about chattel slavery in America is the fact that it was intergenerational. And that's true of caste as well. You're born into a caste, you can't, as you were saying earlier, you can't rise out of it. Her three examples, which made the movie very impressive, we saw it together, I think. She looks at Indian society and the untouchables. There's another name for them now, which I don't remember. So
Is it the dollar?
yeah, that's it. It's very striking. I don't want to spoil it for you. And then it was the Nazi Holocaust, and they had a vignette from that. And then finally, racial discrimination in the South, especially during the era of the civil rights struggles. I very much recommend seeing it. You won't be the same afterwards.
Yeah, and the reading of the book would be like that too. But anyway, this is
Yes, just the movie's large.
so this is what was going on with the poor people in those days. They were in this lower group and had absolutely no way to rise out of that. That just couldn't happen. Okay, in India, I think it's the same way. You can't rise out of that group. And in the United States, it's really tough to rise up out of one of the formerly oppressed classes.
Yeah, so our castes today may be levels of educational attainment, maybe levels of business success, white collar versus blue collar. All those things happen.
Those are different. Caste is
I know.
intergenerational inequality.
Mhm.
That, I mean, you can define it different ways historically, but
Yeah, but
you have to take the intergenerational view.
in many cases, the ones I mentioned turn out to be intergenerational.
Well,
About 100%.
No, this is mandated by society.
Mhm.
but I will say that in my case, at least on one side, my grandparents were immigrants. And
That's true for all of us.
no, my grandparents, literally my grandparents, my grandmother who I loved was an immigrant. She was first one to come to the United States, and her husband, my grandfather, also came to the United States, and they met here in the United States. But, on my mother's side, her mother's family has been in the United States since the 1600s, and on my grandfather on my mom's side, my great grandparents were immigrants, but my grandparents weren't, but irrespective of that, they all came here with nothing. They all came here in what would have been the lower class, and they were all able to rise up out of it. Okay, if you were the child of a slave, the black child of a slave, you didn't have that same opportunity in the United States. You just didn't.
Well, you could rise economically, but you couldn't
Well,
rise out of
it would be really
rise out of your race.
It wasn't as easy to rise economically either,
But it
because
wasn't impossible.
not impossible. So Frank, you're welcome not to share if you don't want to, but you told me a story the other day that
Yes.
might be relevant.
So I grew up in the mostly 60s and 70s. White neighborhood, grade school was all white. High school had 2,000 students, all white, no people of color. Went to Drexel University, there were people of color there, but I never had any like close friends that I hung around with people of color. And then I had a job after college in Morristown Mall, the mall with it all, Gimbel, Sears, and Longacres. And I worked at the camera shop concession in Gimbel's. And I became friendly with a fellow who worked there, my age, a black man. And he was from a very respectable family. Both his parents were surgeons at Temple University Hospital. He was a Temple University student, senior, and his brother was in the orchestra in Bogota, Colombia. Very, very sophisticated family, well-to-do family. And since 1983, I was going off to law school, and we were friendly. So he said to me, "Hey Frank, I'd like to treat you before you leave." And The Verdict was the movie that was out at the time. He said, "I'll treat you to The Verdict. I know you like cheesesteaks. In fact, I had one at midnight last night." On the board.
How you feel today?
I know you like cheesesteaks. I'll treat you to The Verdict, and we'll treat you to John's in Cherry Hill. So when we got done work, 6 or 7 o'clock, whatever it was, we went to the movie theater, and we decided to save money on milk duds or whatever, go to the Rite Aid or whatever was across the parking lot and get some candy. And so we were sort of dressed like I am now. We took our ties off because we came from work at Gimbel's. We went in there, he looked around and he said, "Now watch, there's someone way back in the corner stocking the shelves. As soon as we go down an aisle, she's going to find a reason to come down that aisle and pretend she's looking for something." Okay, so I'm there looking for M&Ms or something. She comes down the aisle, she's like this, looking us over, and comes back, doesn't find anything on the shelves, and goes away. And I said, "What's that all about?" "Well, I'm black, and you were with me. This is my life every day." And that really changed how I looked at things yesterday.
They refer to driving while black,
Yeah.
like driving while intoxicated.
And I've known several people. I still have some people who are in a position to hire people, and they are reluctant to hire anybody, that's non-white. And it's just annoying. So it's not as easy. The ethnic communities don't have as easy a time pulling themselves up out of that poverty as my grandparents did.
Well, there's also the thing of the talk. So in a lot of Black families, fathers have the talk with their sons and probably their daughters too, helping them understand what they need to do when they're stopped by the police. And that's part of.
Does anyone here have any personal experiences they could share along these lines?
Yeah, my wife works with a highly educated PhD who has a position of quite great responsibility at Montgomery County Community College. She no longer works there, but while she was, my wife was very good friends with her. And in their conversations, she said, I get stopped by the police at least twice a week. That's her life.
Okay,
Yes.
so I don't want to have, it's not just white that have prejudices against other races. It's non-whites who have, for example, if you don't see my face and you don't know my name, you never know what I am. So I'm on the phone a lot, and someone clearly is not a native, like they have an accent when they're speaking to me. I mean, that they're not from this country either, they're an immigrant. And if they don't get what they want from me, then they want my name, they demand my name, and they're going to report me. They want to talk to my supervisor.
soon as I give you my name. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm like, okay, I don't have an accent. You were fine with me until I gave you my name. As soon as I gave you my name, you got the fact that I wasn't a white American. So then you said, do you understand what I'm saying? And you're the one who has this thick accent. So it's not just white people that have these prejudices, it's everybody.
It's very hard to overcome.
Yeah.
And it's pretty undeniable. There are people that try to deny it, but you can't improve if you don't first recognize that there's a problem. So this is a problem that we all face and we all need to deal with. Another book I can recommend is one called White Fragility. Okay, and that's a little more directed at white people who don't grasp the fact that there's racism embedded in us. And it's very hard to overcome, and it has some good anecdotes, which we don't have time to get into. I need to move on now. So in her book, Wilkerson calls out Nazi Germany, the caste system of India, and the race-based caste pyramid in the United States. And she says that those systems rely on stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest ranked people at the bottom. So the question for us is, are we ready to act justly and make a difference? So we don't have much time. I was going to go into some of these passages from the Sermon on the Mount, which are very familiar to you all. This is the one about you're the salt of the earth and you're the light of the world. Well, what does that even mean? I'm going to go through this quickly. So someone might say Fred is the salt of the earth or Amy's the salt of the earth sort of person. What do they mean when they say that? Sure, we've all heard that phrase, right?
They bring something special to their lives that impact positively on the people around them. I think of salt as adding seasoning to food and making it taste better. So their contribution through their lives to the rest of us is a positive one.
Right.
It makes our lives better.
Or they give us high blood pressure.
I've never heard the phrase used that way. So I don't think that's what I think. Russ is closer. It brings salt brings flavor, but it also can be used to preserve things, right?
Oh, yeah, right.
Okay. So in Christ's time, salt was connected with three special qualities: purity, preservatives, and flavor. So it's glistening. Whiteness made the connection easy. So purity easy. The Romans said salt was the purest of all things because it came from the purest of all things, the sun and the sea. They made it by drying seawater. If we're to be the salt of the earth, we need to be examples of purity, adhering to standards of honesty, diligence, and morality. And James put it this way. James said that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Salt was the commonest preservative. It kept things from going bad. It held purification at bay. And if we're to be the salt of the earth, we need to have an antiseptic influence. We should be the person who, by our presence, inhibit corruption. We should make it easier for others to be good.
And it enabled mummification for the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Trustworthy, isn't that a good name for it?
What's that?
Trustworthy.
Trustworthy. Well, I can give a personal example. I never swear. I really don't. I grew up that way. I've just never picked up curse words. And especially at one of the divisions I transferred into at Unisys, that was not the norm. It was not. Okay. And I came there, and a year or two later, someone commented to me that the whole tone of conversation in the whole building had been affected.
You
know,
impacted the culture.
people had backed off of all the foul language. And, that, I was pleased to hear that, I don't, I mean, it's just you can impact people just by the way you are. And I think that's the real message. That's a sort of trivial example of it. But by being there, by being the kind of person Christ calls us to be, you can have an influence on the people around you. And that's what it means to be the salt of the earth. It sends flavor to things. And the world might not see it that way, but thank goodness for our fellowship committee, because people might not think of Christians as happy, fun-loving people. They might think of us as sour, wet blankets, but we're not, and we can have nice fellowship and be welcoming to people, and that's what we should be trying to do. If a seasoning has no flavor, it's useless. And Jesus told his disciples that if they wanted to make a difference in the world, they'd have to be useful. God would hold them accountable. So what do we need to do to be useful in the world?
Make a difference in the world by what we're doing, how we do it, how we present ourselves.
Stand up for what's right.
Stand up.
Honor all people, no exceptions.
Thank you. Yes. So which of these roles, I don't have time to go through all these, but I was going to go through them one by one and ask you the question. Are we supposed to do that with our families, with our colleagues, with our neighbors, as part of our social activities, through community events and activities and our church involvements? And I think the answer would be all of the above. So we need to ask ourselves, is the world a better place because we're in it, or does it taste just the same as if we weren't there? Hopefully it's better. The other one that's in that section is that you're the light of the world. And light is one of the things, I did a word search on that a while back and shows up an awful lot too, as a metaphor for good, as opposed to darkness being a metaphor for evil. God said, let there be light, and there was light. That's the very first thing. Even before the sun was made, the light was there. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path. The light comes through God's word. The unfolding of your words gives light. It gives understanding to the simple. I am the light of the world, Jesus said. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of light. And then he says, you are the light of the world. Here in this verse. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. We're meant to be the light of the world. But he says, I'm the light of the world. So how are we the light of the world? Well, we're the light of the world by mirroring him. By mirroring him, by channeling him. Light can't coexist with darkness. A very famous quote from Martin Luther King was, darkness can't drive away darkness, only light can do that. Hate can't drive away hate, only love can do that. So if you're tempted to get into an argument with somebody, if you're tempted to express displeasure with somebody, think about that. That's two wrongs don't make a right. A fight is a fight, and being a part of a fight is still darkness, not light. Be the light. Turn the other cheek.
Yeah, I hope this is relevant. We just welcomed confirmation class into our midst. And as Pastor pointed out, their desire to follow Jesus isn't the end, it's the beginning. And it's the same with us. When we made a decision to follow Jesus, that's the beginning for us. And now as we live it, we have got to figure out ways, especially today, to love better and to trust Jesus and to invite him into our lives, to dissipate my angst, to dissipate my, difficult feelings, to dissipate the way I interact with people that I don't love, and to help me to learn to stop focusing on me and to focus on others and to be more helpful to others that I can possibly be. And so I'm learning how to do that. And I'm trying because I desire to follow Jesus. I desire, especially in this time, to love well and to do well. And I am depending on him to show me the way. And I would invite you to do the same thing. Sorry, Jay, that's my parting
That's really good.
sentiments.
So Jesus says, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Let's take that to heart. To follow Jesus, we're called to be the light of the world, to let our light shine through the good works we do. We need to seek justice and prayerfully consider our attitude toward people, especially the poor and others who aren't like us. We need to recognize injustice when we see it and be willing to speak against it. We need to be willing to step outside our comfort zone. We need to be willing to make sacrifices. And most of all, when we endeavor to let our light shine, we need to be mindful that it's not really our light, but the light of Christ shining through us. So that is it, almost on time.
Nice lesson.